paper tells an old story with a new ending. My discussion here serves as a reminder that return to manuscript sources remains important even when their texts have been long published. To the extent that I offer a new perspective, I emphasize that this return refreshes even securely established narratives. My subject is the monastic reform of the 12th century, a region of medieval studies well explored since early modernity, reworked in the early 20th century invention of interdisciplinary medieval studies, and revisited in the later 20th century and recent decades by historicism, feminism, and cultural studies. One could well wonder what the textual and codicological history of works by the leaders of the 12th century reform of regular religious life might still contribute to understanding of their times. The medieval voice this paper proposes that we hear differently on the basis of one theological manuscript is Philip of Harvengt's in his so-called De Institutione Clericorum, often translated as On the Education of Clerics. This abbot and religious reformer, who died in 1183, was also the biblical commentator notorious for writing the longest of the many monastic commentaries on the Song of Songs, an exegetical tract coming to some 300 columns in the Patrologia Latina, the great 19th century series of patristic and medieval texts, which ends with works of his own generation in the mid-12th century. Philip's oeuvre occupies an entire volume of the PL, so he had still more than that to say. The Abbé Migne, the editor of the Patrologia, was concerned that Philip's works be fully harvested in the series which, for better and worse, grounds much of subsequent modernity's sense of the medieval past, especially of religious life. When I mention Migne, many scholars, even outside of medieval studies, will immediately recognize God's plagiarist, as he is called in Howard Bloch's rollicking 1994 send-up, subtitled as An Account of the Fabulous Industry and Irregular Commerce of the Abbé Migne. We know Migne was a slapdash broker of the Latin fathers and their medieval inheritors. And we know that most of the vast material he and his agents hurled into print was derived from faulty manuscripts and tendentious early editions. What we think about less are the sequela, how hard it is to unravel interpretations grounded in Migne texts. Here I wish to parse readings of Philip, whose importance here is not just in himself for his reformist role, but also as exemplary of the interpretations of medieval thought built on the 200-odd thick volumes of the PL. Philip is of particular interest as one of two eminent early authors of the medieval order of Premonstratensians, the so-called White Canons founded in 1121 in the epicenter of monastic reform, the borderlands between the Empire and the French Kingdom. Philip was a direct disciple of Norbert of Xanten, the inspiration of the Premonstratensians, or consequently Norbertines, Norbertin. Although Norbert himself left no securely attributable written words, Philip made up for that. And although Norbert throughout his life backed away from conflict, Philip sallied forth in the conviction that the conjunction of asceticism and community prayer with commitment to priestly service to the world advocated by Norbert and his most vocal companion, Anselm of Havelberg, was the loftiest form of Christian life. This pugnacity led Philip to run afoul of the most prominent voice of the 12th century Reformation, Bernard of Clairvaux, when he obstructed the great Cistercian support of a white canon who attempted to flee to Bernard's own order. Philip was no match for the self-described chimera of his age, and for his temerity was for a long interval deprived of his own abbacy of Bonne-Espérance in Hainaut. But that period of exile and introspection grew Philip's written legacy to the huge scale memorialized in the PL. The work we consider today has been an important source in recent decades' revision of the narrative of medieval religious reform. The history of religious orders is often one in which a few enthusiasts talk to themselves and on a good day to a few others, as I'm well positioned to understand as a historian of the Order of Premonstratensians. Philip of Harvengt is indeed a player, so to say, in the long historiography of the Premonstratensians, in which a conflict between the contemplative practices attributed to Western, that is French and English communities of white canons, is sometimes set in contrast to more active engagement with secular populations in Eastern German-speaking regions. My own position is that this is a false dichotomy, so I am here more interested, and my discussion of the continuing surprise in manuscript work is more concerned with the ways in which eminent scholars of 12th century religious belief and practice have understood Philip's voice. Caroline Bynum's first major published essay elevated Philip's On the Education of Clerics in her compelling argument that Augustinian canons had a relatively greater commitment to teaching by word and example than did traditional Black monks. More recently, Rachel Fulton Brown, famous in the last few years for reasons other than her sensitive work on medieval religion, centered Philip in her massive From Judgment to Passion for his erotic development of the theology of the Virgin Mary. So Philip of Harvengt, these historians have argued forcefully, was important for 12th century thought and feeling. Philip's writing as interpreted in these magisterial accounts largely depends on his comprehensive study of aspects of the character of clerical status as published in the PL. Its context in about 1150 was a pivotal moment in the medieval history as the Gregorian reform in medieval history, as the Gregorian reform reached its fruition in the conflict of empire and papacy and the separation of clergy from laity. On the education of clerics, as Bynum persuasively argued, charges those bound to common life under the rule of St. Augustine, not the Benedictine rule as refreshed in the Cistercian vision, to inform secular persons, docere verbo et exemplo. Philip seems here, as the PL's titling predicates, and there's the overall title page, and then the more specific contents, to explore clerical privilege and responsibility in a broad sense, and to call clergy in general, not just his Premonstratensian confreres, to inspiration toward their leadership of the European Church. We have no immediate reason to believe that the words Migne set in type as De Institutione Clericorum might have been otherwise intended. The sheer weight of this part of the PL's Philip, 540 columns, might give us pause in that a grand suite of related questions and answers, as we see this discussion to be as soon as we penetrate its columns, rings more of the scholastic summa of the following century than of 12th century monastic discourse. But Philip was undeniably prolix. Remember the interminable song commentary. Still, the odd constitution of PL 203 should make us curious how the manuscript tradition represents it. And to reconsider Migne's Philip is an unlooked-for treat, because a commensurately large manuscript preserved in the Bibliothèque Royale de Belgique is the primary means of assessing the PL De Institutione. In the same library, in the room across the hall, the first printed edition of the works of Philip is available for collation. To bring these two artifacts into conversation is to offer a primer in how Migne worked, in this case extending usefully into how we still depend on the PL for all its faults, and how its errors still bend our interpretations. In telling this story, we need to skip around. To begin with the Migne text as Bynum, Fulton, and other historians of the order have begun. The PL's table of contents in the volume entirely devoted to Philip's work outlines its scope and adds a few spurious texts outside our discussion here. Clearly, Philip's principal treatise, as reconstructed by Migne, is De Institutione Clericorum. As we find out below in the body of the text, it is divided to sections on the dignity, learning, justice, continence, obedience, and silence of clerics, that is, those ordained to holy orders. But we begin in some confusion. Here, Migne's listing of texts characteristically misses something important, the leftmost digit in the listing of columns, so that the numeration seems to go backward from 665, where De Institutione ends, to 205, which should be 1205, where the life of St. Augustine begins. We then turn to the Brussels manuscript of this work to explore the author's own arrangement of his thought. When we open the volume surviving as BRB 2, 1158, we find, in contrast to the PL's crabbed font and cramped columns, a beautifully copied and meticulously decorated folio volume. Examination of its codicology and provenance explains the codex's deluxe character. This compilation of Philip of Harvengt's works was made by several closely similar early 13th century hands. Too late to be his autograph, it is nonetheless marked as the possession of his own house, the Abbey of Our Lady of Good Counsel, Sancta Mariae Bonae Spei, here marked on the bottom right of the first opening. This volume contains occasional corrections apparently against an exemplar. Its general paleographical traits affirm that some 20 years after its first abbot's death, his own religious community planned and executed a written treasure enshrining his words about aspects of their life and mission. Perhaps it was copied directly from Philip's autograph, but almost certainly from a manuscript very close to the autograph. Decorated capitals of various scales and elaboration seem again to follow in exemplars, with further headings added in a hand nearly contemporary to the text hands. Strikingly, the Brussels copy of what Migne later called De Institutione offers a summary of its contents, set forth in medieval fashion rather than as the PL does among a broader listing of the author's collected works, so dividing its bundle of texts in both titling and organization, and demonstrating that it was organized from the first as a collection with the contents it still has, rather than gathered later for mutual relevance. But there appears in the manuscript no discrete series of discussions with the title De Institutione Clericorum. Instead, the codex carrying those of Philip of Harvengt's writings occupying the largest section of the PL volume is organized as a series of 5 responsiones, responses to queries by the abbot's confreres to fundamental questions on humankind's capacity for salvation. Only one section is devoted to the loftiness of priestly orders, De Dignitate Clericorum. The latter discourse, as the PL represents it in the first of 6 sections of De Institutione, follows responsiones on the salvation of Adam and the damnation of Solomon, and precedes responsiones on, respectively, the virtues of obedience and silence. The list of contents on the volume's first written folio, here, accurately summarizes the following nearly 250 leaves. We might pause for a moment to read on about clerical dignity from the decorated initial C at your lower left, cum inter fratres meos. When among my brothers there was discussion of divine scriptures, and though I knew nothing, they asked me about various matters. Philip begins in humble conversation, turning first to the way in which all mankind is implicated in Adam's fall. Here our concern is not to explore how the Premonstratensian abbot, in some respects resonating with his so-called maximalist contemporaries Hildegard and Abelard, understood the fall, rather to note that the primary surviving witness to his great work, De Institutione Clericorum, seems less to center on the education of the clergy than to affirm its dignitas, clerical stature, and the obligations of leadership. The text is, with minor variants, what we know from Migne. Why does the PL frame it differently? Details of the manuscript's division of the 40 leaves of its section De Dignitate Clericorum yet again differ from the PL rendering. Notably, Migne's 2 treatises De Justitia on justice and De Continentia on continence, although rubricated in the BRB manuscript, are here copied as integral to Philip's work on the dignity of clerics, so without independent status. De Obedientia and De Silentio, by contrast, separate sections in the PL, like the discussions of justice and obedience, are represented in the manuscript as discrete texts. As the listing on the first leaf of the volume had anticipated, they are marked as no more closely connected to De Dignitate than the responsiones on Adam and Solomon, which appear ahead of it in the Codex. Philip's big book, in its codicological arrangement, thus emphasizes the work of clerics in the universal history of salvation, taking Adam and Solomon as paradigmatic, outlining the prestige of religious life, De Dignitate, then drawing out discussion of 2 of its constituent disciplines, obedience and silence. Further features of the Brussels manuscript's text divisions again challenge the PL's division of a putative De Institutione Clericorum into 6 constituent treatises on, respectively, the dignity of clerics and their learning, justice, continence, obedience, and silence. The entire series begins with a decorated initial for De Dignitate, and De Scientia is rubricated, but only marginal titles in a subsequent contemporary hand mark off discussions of clerics, justice, and continence. Very likely, the copyist here followed his exemplar's model in repeating minimalist, likely marginal text divisions up until what the PL renders as the final sections of De Institutione, that is, the disproportionately long discussions of obedience and silence. In the Brussels copy, De Obedientia and De Silentio are each begun with a large rubricated initial, as if they were new beginnings rather than continuations of De Dignitate. In some, there is no manuscript evidence that Philip intended a 6-part treatise on clerical life. De Dignitate Clericorum, some 60 leaves long, is followed by De Obedientia, just over 40 leaves long. De Silentio leaves, but these latter sections on obedience and silence appear as separate responsiones rather than parts of a great discourse on the institution of the clergy. How is clerical status special? What is the role of obedience in priestly life? Why is silence important in religious community? These are the questions from his brothers that Philip of Harvengt answered, the occasions for abbatial collations, rather than divisions of a synoptic vision of the life of canons, priests living in Augustinian community. Put another way, according to the manuscript evidence, there is no on the education of clerics from the hand of Philip of Harvengt. How did it come about that the PL so misrepresents Philip's textual taxonomy, and why might that matter? The prior question is of interest only as a paleographical detective story familiar to medievalists. A likely scenario is that marginal notes added to the original text for early readers' convenience were in later copies included as internal headings. So the exemplar of BRB 2 1158 may have included marginal marks for the beginnings of sections of the De Dignitate passages on knowledge, justice, and continence. Later eyes then saw the separate works on obedience and silence as more in a list of clerical attributes. Thinking back on the PL's presentation of a work on the education of clergy, and finding no such title in the manuscript, we note further that only 4 major text sections comprise the medieval representation of this text, rather than the 6 sections defined by the PL. The last 2 parts of the PL's De Institutione, the heftiest, are here separate. So we might wonder what were the steps in the middle in this model. The answer lies in the text history between the 13th century copy and Migne's intervention. The hands which produced the great Brussels manuscript seem to have attempted an accurate reflection of those works bearing on fallen human nature and the way in which the white canons of St. Norbert might answer human needs. The goal of the PL was instead to publish medieval works at breakneck speed. But not even God's plagiarist and his helpers would likely have made so thoroughgoing a miscasting of the structure of Philip's work had a 17th century publication not intervened. The early modern history of Philip's works, the organization of the edition on which the PL's introduction acknowledges the Migne text depended, suggests an explanation. In 1620, one of Philip's eventual successors as abbot of Bonne-Espérance, Nicolas Chamard, published an edition of the earlier Premonstratensians writings, grounding these texts in manuscripts still preserved at the abbey at which their careers were separated by nearly 400 years. Chamard's representation of Philip's content on salvation history and clerical life differs in some minor details from the surviving Brussels Codex, but his edition of Philip's works suggests that it shared an immediate ancestor, a now lost Bonne-Espérance exemplar that marked the sections of De Dignitate with marginal notes. Chamard's typesetter, though, opened the way for the Migne text's erroneous representation of Philip's considerations on obedience and silence. Although the manuscripts had marked De Obedientia and De Silentio as separate, the edition distinguishes them only with a line of typographic dummies, similar in shape and scale to the ornaments dividing off sections of its edition of De Dignitate. Lamentably, I do not have an image of one of the relevant pages of the 1620 edition, but imagine a modest line of typographic figures as text division in place of an ornamented manuscript capital. When the PL's assistant plagiarists picked up Chamard's edition, they asserted themselves in full 19th century orderliness, inventing a work called De Institutione Clericorum. But the text is almost entirely the same as both Chamard's and the Brussels Codexes. Why might this officious misrepresentation matter? What does it have to do with the valence of Philip's work? The Belgian paleographer Paul Tombour has completed a digital survey of Philip of Harvengt's language for Corpus Christianorum. He notes that the deluxe manuscript of Philip's works from Bonne-Espérance has received less attention than it merits because it was inadvertently omitted from Van den Gaen's 19th century catalog, the standard scholarly guidebook to Brussels manuscripts. Tambour argues, as I do here, that the title De Institutione Clericorum should be abandoned in favor of a representation of Philip's collations here as responsiones, responses to his confreres, as the Brussels manuscript effectively mandates. He observes about the abbot of Bonne-Espérance, ce qui est clair, c'est que Philippe est un grand personnage qui n'a guère eu de chance, that the vagaries of the history of his texts have miscast both the magnitude and the meaning of Philip's voice. Tambour, writing here in 2004, was not thinking of Philip's major role in Rachel Fulton's study of the cult of the Virgin, or for that matter, of Caroline Bynum's distinction of canonical and monastic spiritualities. I am, however. Brussels 2:1158 offers us a Philip of Harvengt who, instead of composing a great tractatus on the education of clerics, set down a series of conversations with his confreres, each beginning, Quaeritis, fratres, you ask, my brothers. Although we might read those discussions with Migne as about all of the European clergy, with Bynum as about Augustinian canons in general, or with Fulton as the edgy voice of a rapidly developing devotion to the Blessed Virgin, we might, on the basis of Brussels 2:1158, find something simpler. The abbot in his chapter house answering fundamental theological questions about how man came to sin and how they, the white canons of St. Norbert, might deploy that insight to improve their world. The title matters not at all, except that it does, because the misleading label placed on his work by God's plagiarist remains the single most important signpost for the 21st century reader engaging with Philip of Harvengt. And Migne and his staff used tiding inventively, not only in the overall frame for Philip's suite of written conversations with his confreres. Both the Brussels manuscript and the Chamar edition add the genitive clericorum, of clerics, ordained clergy, to only the first section of what Migne then calls the education of clerics. The further parts are the manuscript evidence demonstrates about knowledge, justice, continence, obedience, silence, only by implication and association among clerics. The passage's content and context, as well as their obvious audience, refer to religious community, but they nowhere specifically address a canonical audience. Caroline Bynum was certainly right that these texts bespeak Augustinian spirituality. I would say further, a Premonstratensian charism. But that is not to say that Philip here, in setting his conversations on the virtues of life and community in the context of Adam's fall, Solomon's reprobation, and as the surviving text concludes, the Sermon on the Mount, does not intend his hearers or readers to understand themselves as leaven in the mass of humankind. The virtues he illumines are not only canonical, the goals of ordained clergy living under a religious rule. They do not set the ordained Augustinians in his community apart from the whole of humanity, so much as embed them in it. So the massive Brussels copy of Philip's work ends with the discussion of the Beatitudes, closing as it began with the fate of souls. But Migne's titling still obscures both the breadth of Philip's vision and the particularity of his perspective. God's plagiarist miscommunication of the work of Philip of Harvengt has undercut scholarly attention to both this 12th century author and the order of Premontre. Bynum and Fulton, indeed the whole school, so to say, of Giles Constable, all rightly profoundly influential scholars of the medieval religious life, have brought Philip into the light of academic discussion, but never as Premonstratensian. In the PL, Philip seems, when he is not writing about the cult of the Virgin, as implicit in the Song of Songs, to address the role of clerics in general. But the abbot's point of departure in each of the responsiones for which Brussels 2:1158 is the proximate medieval witness is, you ask, my brothers. Further attention to the work of Philip of Harvengt should invite medievalists to reconsider his role as we see it in this great codex, opening to the first leaf and entering into a chapter of the early white canons.